to the American mispronunciation. Hey, we're
There we
live.
go. There we go. Well, live from the SSM Health Treffert Studios, welcome to Divergent Minds. My name is Dr. Ashwin Sood, and I'm here along my wonderful co-host, Dr. Jeremy Chapman. And we are two board-certified child and adolescent psychiatrists here working in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, seeing both teenagers and adults and young kids when it comes to mental health. And this is our weekly podcast where we talk about everything mental health related. How are you doing today, Dr. Chapman? And what are we talking?
Doing good, and I'm really excited actually to learn today because this is a topic that I get asked about a fair amount, and I think it will probably increase in the years to come. And I don't think I have a solid enough kind of response or understanding of it. So I'm looking forward to you teaching us all about. Well, I mean, there's many different ways for to call it: cannabis, marijuana, THC, weed, pot. What's your go-to?
Ganja, ganja,
Ganja,
grass,
broccoli.
broccoli, all the different slang and terms. But strangely enough, all those terms you said, some of those aren't the same as others.
Correct. Yes, those are not synonymous with one another. Absolutely. Um, so hashish,
Hashish,
if
yeah, or
similar but different, right?
ash,
By the way,
dabbing.
you're starting to know a lot about this. I actually am traveling to Amsterdam, which is kind of funny too, next
Ah,
week, and so this will be good knowledge for me to have there because that's one of the first places I think that some of this stuff was legal and commonplace.
yes.
Um,
And I feel honored that you see me as an expert at this. Hopefully not by
oh,
expertise, but
oh, just based on the number of different, lingo, you just a lot of them. I mean, I listened to a fair amount of music growing up where there were, I'd say, different. It was like a thesaurus, like
yeah,
different synonyms of uh
sure.
of this. But let's jump in. I want to hear. You can, you'll help us by the end of this time understand some of the differences between all those things that we just talked about.
Yeah, and I invite the audience, leave comments, leave questions. Today we're going to be talking about marijuana, weed, THC, CBD, right? What the breakdowns of these things are, what we see amongst our teens and the young adult populations who use this, kind of demystify some of it. Um, if you are listening and hearing like, why are these two psychiatrists talking about weed or marijuana? Dr. Chapman and myself uh, work with a lot of young adults as well as older adults in substance use and kind of working with different substances that can affect mental health. And so when we think about substances, right, there, weed, marijuana is kind of our generation's, it's always been a generational thing that started, even ancient times, and marijuana has been used consistently for thousands of years, but has gotten a lot of notoriety initially in the 60s with the counterculture movement. If there's any historian buffs here with Richard Nixon and basically, pathologizing the drug as a Schedule One drug, saying that, that not to jump too deep into the weeds here like that, but to characterize it as like this is a very harmful substance. And at that time, it was actually a very politicized movement. Um, but I won't get too much into that. But it is a very, in our current time, it's a very hotly talked about topic because
Sure.
it's everywhere. It's in head shops. It's packaged as different things. It's in vape pens now, and
Gas
often
stations.
gas stations, and it often comes into our office as either not an issue or significantly an issue,
Mhm.
impacting people how they're using it. So with that in mind, I thought, we'd kind of first talk about just in general, right? Like looking at the growth of how often people are using. I have some data from a PowerPoint that I presented a couple days ago. We know that up to, and this is from SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse Mental Health kind of nationally, federally regulated organization that looks into this data. And we know that up to 49.6 million teens have used marijuana in the past
Wow.
year alone, above the age of 12. So that is, almost about 30 million more than those who use alcohol or, um, other psychoactive drugs or substances. So it's a pretty high amount.
I have to jump in on this note
Yes.
because there is a Time magazine article about my high school while I went to my high school titled High Times at New Trier High. And it was all about marijuana usage in high school, using my high school in Winnetka, Illinois as the
I see.
example. So those who are watching, who were Trevians with me, we probably remember that. And the big number from that article was 3/5. Everyone was talking about 3/5. That was supposedly the number of students at New Trier High School who reported that they had tried it. So that was kind of like a big finding there. 3/5. Everyone, I just popped back into my mind when you were talking about this. High school.
Absolutely. High school, right? And so we know that, use amongst young adults in the past decade is at an all-time high with marijuana. For example, it's been about in the past decade, it's been a 13% increase of users who are using marijuana daily, versus, the next active drug is hallucinogens, which is like 4.5 to 5%. Alcohol is kind of like steadily declining. Nicotine use has gone up with vaping. But that's kind of, I want whoever's listening to this to kind of think about like these things that you're hearing in the news about marijuana. I mean, they're used more frequently and they're decriminalized and legalized in numerous states, but the use has increased. And I just, for anyone to take that kind of away, I think it's super important. And those are amongst young adults, right? Those are teens. Dr. Chapman, I see teens every single day. So, I'll ask you, Dr. Chapman, do you have like a prototypical, like anonymized kind of case that you have in your head about like the teen that comes in with, you know, depression, anxiety, but there's this heavy cannabis use in the back?
Well, there's a few different archetypes, I would say. There's the one that you just described, where it is being used either in spite of or because of mood or
Yep.
anxiety symptoms, maybe thought to be used as a self-soothing technique, as something that helps calm the person down at the end of the day or put their worries away. So that's one category. There's also people who come in and say that it helps them focus and clear their mind in that sense. And there's other people who come in and say, I do it socially, and it's because I like hanging out with my friends and smoking.
Yep.
I've also had people come in and say my parents do it around me, and if it weren't for them, I wouldn't do it as well. So those are all different cases that walk through the door. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I will say it's an interesting kind of time to be a psychiatrist because as the political landscape is changing and as you're getting more and more data, if whoever's listening wants to hear more about this, right? Data or research into hallucinogens or marijuana, like it's starting to rev up a lot more because of access, but also because there are some therapeutic aspects to these medications and drugs. But I am not all good or all bad on any substance. It is what you're using it for and how you're using it, how often you're using it, and what exactly it's made out of. And I think that is a huge kind of bag of questions that Dr. Chapman and I always have to ask any young adult that comes in or older adult who's heavily relying on any substance because what somebody is selling you or giving you, it really depends on what it is. And
Yeah.
so maybe we can kind of also, you had asked me earlier this morning, like, describing the differences of all of these things. And I think that's
Yes,
important.
please. And
Yeah.
when we have,
So,
just gonna
yeah,
say, we want to get to the point where we can have a third square on here that is kind of our display or image thing. I would have shown
sure.
the Future High article, Google that up quickly. Here's where we could put an image with the different kinds of substances or substances, if you will, and kind of walk through those. But yeah, if you can give us an overview, some of the words that would hopefully work their way into this would be, cannabis, THC,
Sure.
marijuana, K2, Delta
Oh
8,
man,
I hear about,
all the time.
spice. So okay, we'll let you go.
Yeah, so like, and this is something I have to constantly remind myself of because things are always shifting and you're always having to teach yourself. So if you're hearing this for the first time, you're like, whoa, trust me, I was just like you like a couple days ago. So it's always learning. But let's take the basics of cannabis, right? Cannabis is a plant. It's a plant that's made of leaves, stems, seeds, resin, and all of these things, right, in this plant, and there's different species of this plant, but we'll just talk about cannabis. What's it called? I think it's sativa, if I'm not mistaken. I'm going to my notes because I don't want to butcher it and somebody be like, this guy doesn't know. Yeah. So there's sativa, there's indica, and there's hybrid. These are different species of cannabis plants. And the sativa species and the indica species, all these plants have these things, these chemicals called phytocannabinoids. Phytocannabinoids are these kind of chemical structures, and there's over 125 different phytocannabinoids that have been researched. But of those, the two that you hear the most are THC and CBD. And then there is also Delta 8, but we'll get to that later. And THC and CBD are the two primary phytocannabinoids that are in each cannabis plant. And they're varying in different concentrations. But when you hear somebody who goes to a green pharmacy where they pick up their marijuana prescription or whatever have you, which we also can talk about at a later date, but they'll often say, yeah, I got sativa or I got indica. And that's important because each of those types of plants have different concentrations of those two phytocannabinoids. And so when you get somebody who has cannabis sativa or uses that plant primarily to smoke marijuana or vape or dab or whatever, sativa has a high concentration of the phytocannabinoid THC compared to CBD, whereas indica has a much higher concentration of CBD to THC. And that's super important when you talk to anybody who says they use marijuana. My first question when anybody walks in and says they smoke marijuana, I primarily say, what's the ratio of THC to CBD? Or how much THC per milligram that you know is in that amount? Because
what percentage of them know the answer to that?
Very little.
I can't imagine.
And that's the hardest thing about this. This gets into the federal regulation of all of this, is that marijuana, right? Just marijuana in general, there's no FDA approval for it. It is still a Schedule 1 drug. Other Schedule 1 drugs, heroin, right? Hallucinogens. Now, there's a lot of politics that goes into what the scheduling is, but by becoming a Schedule 1 drug by the DEA, means that there's no medical aspect to this that it's helpful for. That is under heavy legislation now that'll most likely change within the next 5 years to a Schedule 3, such as anabolic steroids or other substances, and the other synthetic marijuana drugs such as nebilinone or dronabinol, which for the population out there who's listening, there are synthetic medications out there to give for pain or nausea or vomiting. That is not the marijuana plant, but is a synthetic version of it that's considered FDA approved for those substances.
When you talk about knowing the concentration and stuff like that and the proportions, it just made me think of this. A comparative situation is alcohol. Now, if somebody walks in and says, I drink alcohol, because that's kind of what we're saying, it's an equivalent to. And now I know different types of alcohol, and there's beer and there's wine and there's vodka, which is certain proof. I think it's usually 80 proof. There's rums, which are not as I have a sense just from I think American culture of what some different subtypes of alcohol and their potency and their potential danger and whatnot. Even beers within alcohol by volume is clearly listed on the label when you purchase beer, and you might be able to sense the difference between 6% and 3% or something like that. That stuff is just not known with this whole world. I don't know if it's something where we're headed that way or not, but it's not packaged. It's not purchased the same way in stores. And so
there's a great Rolling Stone article on this because they were like, a lot of people compare marijuana use to alcohol use because of milligrams of THC. It's actually much more different than that, right? So as physicians, we're not just worried about what we're consuming, we're worried about how we're consuming it. Are we snorting it? Are we inhaling it? Are we injecting it, right? Because those all access our brain much faster in different ways.
For sure.
And marijuana can be eaten, it can be smoked or inhaled, right?
Right.
Right. Those right there, you can have different deliveries via those things, and they
Yeah.
can deliver this higher amount of THC in the same equivalent of a puff than like a
Mm-hmm.
joint versus a vape, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's why it gets all of a sudden really confusing because we're like,
Yeah.
wait, there's a certain amount in here, but it's a different way of coming in. So I think one of the biggest things trying to answer your question, right, is, I was presented this by a colleague was if a kid comes in or a teen comes in and says, yeah, I use a vape pen, I'll ask how much is in the cartridge. And if the cartridge is 800 milligrams of THC, I'll say, how often does it take you to get through the cartridge? And if they say, a week, by I think can't remember what exactly the guidelines are, but about 45. I think it's either milligrams or micrograms. I'm going to quickly go to my chart here. 45, the 40 milligrams of THC
Yeah.
is considered heavy use.
Per
So
day?
that is considered per day. Yeah, per one sitting
Per
in
sitting?
general. Per day.
Per
Let's
day.
use per day.
Sure.
And if she's using an 800 milligram cartridge over 7 days, that's about
Wow.
115 milligrams
Yeah.
a day. So that's considered heavy use, right?
And
So
how many
that's
people know how many people know what the size of their cartridge is? I mean, is that something that they pretty much know that they're
that unless you're really actively using all the time, you really don't. And the hardest thing about this is that these aren't regulated things, right? Marijuana is a level one non substance, right? This isn't a regulated industry yet. And so people will come out of the woodwork saying, my dealer or like where it's legalized, I picked it up. They tell me this exact amount of concentration, but none of that is regulated across the board, for example, versus medications or
mm-hmm.
alcohol, right? That's heavily regulated by the
Mm-hmm.
FDA, the ATF, these other three big name agencies.
Mm-hmm.
So these things, right, have a definitive proof, right? In medicine, we're like one shot of liquor is equal to a glass of wine, which is can
Mm-hmm.
sometimes be equivalent to a beer or a beer and a
Mm-hmm.
half, right? Versus we're not really sure where you're getting this from. It says 80 milligrams THC and 20 milligrams CBD, but unless it's like heavily regulated, for example, Epidiolex, which is an FDA synthetic cannabinoid used for epilepsy, has more than 99.9% of it is CBD.
Mm-hmm.
And that is guaranteed versus you go to somebody who's, growing their own plants and selling them, right? And they
Mm-hmm.
tell you like this is 99.9%. They're not going to have the multi-million dollar laboratory equipment to really stratify that.
So we're talking a lot about THC and CBD. So tell us a little bit about the psychogenic effects of each of them. What are the
Love that.
differences?
Fantastic question. So the euphoric high that people most likely talk about when they smoke weed, right? It's coming from THC. That's what we call psychomimetic effects. It binds to receptors called CB1 and CB2 receptors in our brain. These are receptors that we all have. And we also have internal cannabinoids, right? You might not know it, but you are activating the same receptors that THC receptors activate. THC, when it gets into your system and binds to these receptors, it can cause time distortion. It can cause, what's it called, a euphoric feeling,
Mm-hmm.
a sense of that's what we call the high. It can
Mm-hmm.
cause kind of like distortions in perception.
Yeah.
So what you see, what you hear, right? And that's where we see what people say, yeah, I use THC. CBD, on the other hand, has a lot more relaxing properties. It can be given for anxiety. It can be given for panic. And so CBD actually works a little bit differently. It doesn't bind to the same receptor. It actually downregulates that receptor, the
Mm-hmm.
CB1 and CB2 receptors. And so often individuals will come in saying, yeah, I smoke to relax, but they're smoking a lot more THC than CBD. And when you are smoking, obviously, what does it look like, right? What's the quintessential person? Red eyes, they get the munchies, cue if you want to eat your hamburger, now. We were just
I
talking
know
about that
I
earlier.
am in a second. Wait,
Yeah.
so real quick though, that's an interesting point too, because I smoke it to relax, and there's relaxation of mind and relaxation of body.
Yeah.
And some people might view the sensory perception changes or the time dilution changes as cognitively relaxing or emotionally relaxing, whereas perhaps the CBD, down regulation of those receptors is more of a physiological calming.
Yep. Yeah. I think it's more so. This is where I see it a lot. And this is where a lot of teens have even acknowledged in my office that I smoke weed because it helps me not think about the amount of work I have to do or how bad I feel about myself or about all the things that I think about in terms of my social interactions. It distracts me by helping me feel happy in a way and focusing on things that my brain wants to focus on that's not necessarily the stressors of my life.
Pause right there. That last 15 seconds, I think we should take out of context and post as a freestanding clip without the quotation marks around it.
Weed makes me feel happy.
It's a perfect soundbite to remix. So, but there were quotes around that because you were talking about what patients might say. I was just
Yeah.
enjoying watching you say
That's
it. So patients say
funny.
that, yes. And what's your response?
And I say, like, listen, any substance that anyone uses is for a reason. And if you're using it to avoid something, what happens when you ultimately have to face the thing that you have to avoid, that you've been avoiding?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And how will weed help you solve that problem?
Interesting. I like that. I was trained to say pretty much I don't have a comment one way or the other on that.
Yeah.
Some psychiatrists will say, well, then I'm not giving you medicine
Yeah.
because I don't know what that's doing to your brain and I don't know how to keep track of it.
That let me jump in there. That's actually a really important point. There's an argument that weed doesn't have a withdrawal aspect to it that is healthy for you. I want to highlight right now, if you are a heavy user of cannabis, you are most likely, if you try to maintain sobriety, you will go through withdrawal. It will not kill you. It's not a withdrawal that will kill you, but there is a withdrawal, right? Some people will have difficulty sleeping. Some people will have anxiety. Some people will have headaches. They'll have tremors. They'll have sweating. Some people go into what we call cyclical vomiting. Not all, but that can happen when you start throwing up a lot more. If you're heavily using, you have to maintain sobriety for about 3 months before your cognitive effects in terms of your memory, your working memory, your attention comes back to baseline. So anybody who tells me they chronically smoke so they can quit and it'll be like, fine the next day, that's not how it works. And we have
Mm-hmm.
so much data to highlight that.
Okay, that's good to know. And now anxiety in particular is something that I want to make sure that we address because that to me is one of the classic things where it's a chicken and the egg. And people come in and say, I smoke because it helps with my anxiety. And other people, you wonder if anxiety is being exacerbated or worsened by smoking because it can cause that. So
Yeah.
how do you jump into that carousel?
So I jump into that carousel because I say, like, listen, you're using something to help. If you're using something to help, well, let me start off. Were you anxious before smoking? And if
Mm-hmm.
they often say no, and now I'm anxious, then I'm kind of like, okay, that's kind of the culprit we need to kind of start thinking about. But if they're
Mm-hmm.
like, yeah, I've been anxious all my life and the weed helps, then I start asking, like, how much do you smoke? Well,
Mm-hmm.
how much do you smoke in quantity? And if they
Yeah.
give me a number, I'm just like, has it risen over the past year? And
Mm-hmm.
that automatically tells me that they're needing more and more weed to feel less anxious, which means their body is developing a tolerance to it.
So you
So
can.
then,
Okay.
yes, you can
That's
develop a tolerance. You might need to smoke more. I often get people who smoke recreationally and then they have difficulty sleeping, right? Probably because they're withdrawing, right? And then they end up smoking at night and then they often smoke, several puffs before they fall asleep because it's the only
mm-hmm.
thing that helps them fall asleep. And then they end up telling me, I use it for my sleep, right? So
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
you have to get this linear timeline from it.
It's treating its own side effects.
Yes. And as we know in the previous, Divergent Minds, there's no FDA approved medications for sleep. right? This is a naturally kind of phenomenon that we
Mm.
intermittently use medications for, but ultimately we want people to not be on medications for sleep entirely throughout their life. They might need it at times, but that's the whole point, right? So my job is to just gently kind of remind them, like, listen, it sounds like you're using this a lot more to deal with issues. And I wonder if there's ways that it's affecting your body that might not be good. And I
Mhm.
never force people to stop because it's internalized change. If they say, yeah, sure, I'll stop, Dr. Seuss, you're telling me to stop, you're telling me to stop, the likelihood that they're going to change is going to be very low. So this is the whole thing of motivational interview. Kind of just jumping back and saying, how's this helping you? How's this hurting you? If you could quit tomorrow on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being you're going to quit, definitely 1 being, well, not at all, what number you're at.
Mhm.
If you're at a
Mhm.
certain number, how do we get you to a higher number? What keeps you going to a lower number? You know?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
then just really trying to pushing that back forth and forth and forth. Because you don't want to scare people away from you. You don't want to be the stoic, parent who's very like
Sure. Yeah.
harsh on.
Yeah, I've had a couple of patients who on their own initiative, yeah, people who are 17, 18 years old, told me that they wanted to get off of it. Reported the next time that they were succeeding with that. I was doing a little motivational interviewing. They were saving money. They were happier. They were, this is great. I'm doing great on it. So those are some success stories. It's a quarter till, amazingly. Our
Yeah.
time our time sense is, not that we are high, but our time has been, you know, going a different,
Sure.
and I wanted, I know you probably have a couple more slides in there too, but I would be remiss not to bring up psychosis as
Yeah.
something that we talk about, both immediate and chronic use, another pun unintended, that
Yeah.
can cause psychotic symptoms and or even permanent psychotic illness and psychotic breaks. What's your take on that?
Yeah. Biggest take about this is if you have a family history of psychosis or schizophrenia, if you smoke weed, you have an earlier onset of developing psychosis or schizophrenia. So
Which makes
it's not
sense.
a bigger risk factor as well as an earlier potentially onset, and that is a well studied fact.
And I mean, it follows though, because that psychosis really is disorganized thought.
Yep.
And
Yep.
that and what THC, as you were saying, does, it's psychoactive. It basically can jumble up a person's thoughts or interpretations of things around them. So
Yep.
it's not quite synonymous, but in certain ways, I would argue that if you are intoxicated with THC, your brain might be functioning in some ways like the brain of a schizophrenic individual.
It can be.
Insofar
Yeah.
as it's, it is psychosis, and we have different diagnoses in our toolbox. One is, for instance, schizophrenia or psychotic illness, psychosis, and a different one is substance use, such as cannabis use disorder. But there's also substance induced psychosis, which is a time limited phenomenon, but an absolute legitimate diagnosis that can be treated. And so
Oh yeah.
it's not a coincidence that we use the term psychosis when sometimes when referring to the effect of this molecule, basically.
Absolutely. Psychosis is a distortion of perception, right?
Mm-hmm.
Perceptual changes.
Mm-hmm.
So that's it's always important. And I realize as well, we're a little bit out of time, but I think my task, I'll assign it. I want people to read up about CBD and THC, not that they're using or if they're chronically using, just educate yourself a little bit. Check out, SAMHSA, SAMSHA, which is a great website to learn about these things, or the FDA. They have well-researched data that can help you understand the differences between legal and not legal, what your state laws are, things like that.
Looking forward to it. And to bring it full circle to my upcoming trip, I think I'm going to get some closer looks at different people's response to these substances when I'm walking around the streets. My upcoming journey to Amsterdam, and there's so much to learn and so much that we still don't know. And I think Dr. Seuss and I are both excited to watch how this unfolds over the course of our careers. What ends up being, happening with this substance, and does it start to be more generally accepted and even used as a legitimate treatment? Do you think you'll ever prescribe someone any form of CBD or THC?
Yeah, there's actually data actually that we've used in psychotic individuals for IV
Yeah.
CBD that has shown reduction in anxiety. Definitely. There's a lot of good data. I think it's past hallucinogenic studies that we know that CBD can be helpful, can also be used for withdrawal. But in order to prescribe it, right, it has to be legal, and it has to be something that the FDA can approve, right?
Mhm.
And so, or has so for you to do that, you would actually have to go through certain pharmacies that actually have that approval to do that. So we're not there yet in
Okay.
terms of like a tablet or a pill that's easy to get to for people.
Great info. Great to
Yeah,
chat about this. I
so
mean, we
much
could
fun.
learn tons more. We could see if we could get Tommy Chong for a follow-up episode. I think I could probably reach him. So,
Absolutely. Well,
okay.
we'll end with, we'll end with that. My name is Dr. Ashwin Sood. I'm with the wonderful Dr. Jeremy Chapman. We are Divergent Minds, a weekly podcast held here at 12:15 to 12:45 Central Standard Time at the SSM Health Treffert Studios. If you're interested in learning more, follow us at our Facebook group or our website. Y'all have a wonderful day.
See you, everybody.